Man took own life in car on hill. A 33-year-old company representative found dead in his car on White Horse Hill, Uffington, had beside him a photograph of two children with the words, "The ultimate failure," written on it. An inquest at Abingdon heard yesterday. Also on the seat beside Philip John were a tablet bottle with the top off and a half-drunk bottle of whiskey, PC Hollins told the coroner. A piece of vacuum cleaner hose led inside the car from the exhaust. Dr. Richard Cowdell, consultant pathologist at the Radcliffe Infirmary, Oxford, said that Philip John of Cox Green, Maidenhead, died from carbon monoxide poisoning. After hearing that Philip John had severe matrimonial problems, the coroner, Mr. Norman Challoner, recorded that he took his own life. My dad committed suicide on October 29th, 1974. His death left my mum, younger brother and I in terrible turmoil. Today, 49 years later, I can still clearly remember being told. It was a wonderfully warm, sunny day for the end of October. I was across the road playing with Neil and Julie on the carpet of their lounge floor, as we often did. I remember the phone ringing. It was in the kitchen, behind a door separating it from the lounge, as all the houses were in Farmer's Way. Auntie Wendy disappeared into the kitchen and started talking in hushed tones, but I gave it no thought, as grown-ups often spoke in hushed tones on the telephone. Auntie Wendy came back into the lounge, slowly and gently. She told me that my mum wanted to speak to me. I said I'd run across the road and be back in a few moments, so I wouldn't need to put my shoes on. Auntie Wendy insisted, so I gave in. I skipped across the deserted road and plunged into the front door of our house, number 20. Instantly, the heavy silence surprised me. Our house was never quiet. The front of the house faces roughly south, so the sunshine was pouring into the front room. We used to have a large white woolen rug in the centre, and Harry, our much-loved dog, was sunning herself on it contentedly. The tranquillity was strange, but not disconcerting. As I crossed the lounge, Mum emerged from the kitchen from where she'd just been speaking to Auntie Wendy on the phone. On such a warm day, I was surprised to see Mum in a thick, deep brown overcoat tied at the waist. With her coat on, she sat me down on the sofa and explained that Daddy was dead. It felt like the end of the world to me. I had no comprehension of life without Dad. It was just not possible. I cried solidly for many hours. Much later, I found out that my younger brother Mike had been told earlier and was with Grandad. Mum lived nearly 30 years after that, but never once did she talk about that day or even allude to it. Telling your two children of 8 and 10 years old that Daddy was dead must have ranked as the worst day of her life, at least to that point. In the weeks and months that followed, I was told many times that I had to be the man of the house, that I had to look after my mum and my brother, and that big boys don't cry. To me, at 10 years old, this obviously meant that I had to ruthlessly suppress my feelings and seal them in an impregnable vault deep inside my mind. Alas, I've always been a hard-on-my-sleeve kind of guy, someone who shows his feelings easily. So to try and contain those feelings so thoroughly was only ever going to be a recipe for disaster. 3 or 4 years later, those feelings exploded outwards, and I spent the better part of a year in ferocious anger, fear, confusion and pain. Though I didn't know it at the time, such things weren't talked about in those days. Thus began a lifetime of mental health problems for me as I continued to battle with fearful bouts of depression. Fortunately, today, mental health discussions are frequent as the whole area of psychological health has long since stopped being regarded as a taboo subject, at least here in Blighty. Dad's suicide obviously affected our whole extended family terribly, and Mum spent many months during the following year in what, in profound ignorance, I would have called at the time a loony bin. Fairmile Hospital near Reading in Berkshire was a mental health hospital for more than 100 years before it closed in 2003. We visited Mum there just once. It was horrible. I felt a deep, dreadful oppression even before we walked in. When we did, Mum was sitting on a leather sofa in a large open foyer. She looked like Mum. Her voice had the same tonal qualities, but it wasn't Mum. It was her form, but she was not there. It was like her body was functioning, but empty. I couldn't stand it for long, and Mike and I waited outside while Grandad spoke with Mum. If 1974 was a terrible year for me and my family, it was little better for Great Britain. Edward Heath won a surprise election victory in 1970, but presided over a country racked with strikes, losing more work days since the general strike of 1926. On the 9th of February 1971, the first British soldier was shot dead in Northern Ireland. The early 1970s saw Great Britain in the grips of economic recession, and by 1972 unemployment passed 1 million, its highest rate since the Second World War. By 1974, inflation topped 19%, and in 1975 it peaked at an eye-watering 25%. In 1974, Edward Heath's government was under huge, intolerable pressure as strike action throughout British industry continued to cripple the country. But when coal mines, railways and power stations shut down, electricity was effectively rationed, and Great Britain was reduced to a 3-day working week. Heath called a snap election for February the 28th and sought a deal with the opposition parties, but he failed and Harold Wilson became Prime Minister for the third time. If 1974 was a terrible year for me, my family and Great Britain, it was little better for the greater family of the United States. With 60 years of hindsight, it's incredible to look back and see that in November 1972, Republican President Richard M. Nixon was re-elected to office in a landslide victory. Just 5 months previously, on the 17th of June, 5 men had been caught breaking into the Democratic Party headquarters in the Watergate complex of Washington, D.C. It quickly transpired that the committee to re-elect President Nixon was involved, and later the White House itself was revealed to have participated in a protracted, often illegal, dirty tricks campaign against their Democratic opponents. On the 8th of November 1974, President Richard M. Nixon became the first and only US President to resign. Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward were the lead reporters for the Washington Post when it was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service in 1973. They've written extensively, and 2 titles, All the President's Men and The Final Days, describe the incredible complexities and the impact of the Watergate scandal. Right at the end of The Final Days, there's a transcript of President Nixon's final moments in the White House, taken from recordings just before his resignation speech was broadcast live on national US radio and television on the 8th of August 1974. The President says to his staff, "I just hope I haven't let you down." Recalling that time while talking to David Frost in the world-famous TV interviews of 1977, Nixon admitted that he'd let down my friends, let down the country, I let down our system of government. He also said, "I'm sorry." But that was not all that Americans had to worry about. By November, the New York Times reported that inflation had reached more than 12%, and that was on top of rising unemployment. The United States was sinking into the worst recession since the Great Depression of the 1930s. On top of all this, in October 1973, Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack against Israel in what became known as the Yom Kippur War. Many countries, including the USA and Great Britain, supported Israel during the war, and in response, the oil-producing countries in OPEC, led by King Faisal of Saudi Arabia, cut production and imposed an oil embargo. This caused the price of crude oil to rise from $3 a barrel in October 1973 to nearly $12 a barrel by March 1974. The early 1970s are, therefore, synonymous with the three great economic evils of inflation, unemployment, and shrinking national economies: a global recession. I don't remember being interested in motorcycles in the early 1970s, but I certainly was by the late 1970s, although a motorcycle in those days was Japanese, as no one else was making anything that we, as teenagers, would look at twice. This meant that then, as now, perhaps the most beautiful motorcycle ever created was the incomparable Kawasaki Z900, or the Z1. That's Z, spelt Z-E-D. On the face of it, 1974 for the Harley-Davidson Sportster looks amazingly good. Production of the XLH and the XLCH had reached record levels. Although there are no sales figures available for the early 1990s onwards, as far as I can tell, 1974 represents the highest ever sales for the wonder that is the Sportster. The XLH 1000 sold 13,295 units, and the XLCH 1000 sold 10,535. That equals total Sportster sales of a monstrous 23,830. AMF was certainly getting their high sales wish. For 1974, the Sportster was offered in birch white, vivid black, sunburst burgundy, or sunburst blue. So, not for the first time in the often turbulent history of Harley-Davidson, the Sportster and the motor company should have been soaring into unrestrained success. But it was not. There have been many arguments about whether AMF were the Harley-Davidson saviours or the root of all Harley-Davidson evil. The evil, such as it was, began 2 years after AMF took control of the motor company. In 1971, William H. Davidson was promoted to a mere figurehead role as chairman of a board which didn't really exist, and AMF installed John O'Brien as president instead. O'Brien had spent the previous 13 years at Chrysler, but as a dedicated AMF man, he seems to have been committed to returning Harley-Davidson to success and profitability. The evil here was that in 1971, AMF put their logo next to the hallowed Harley-Davidson logo on the motorcycle petrol tanks for the 1972 models. And not just next to, but often in front of.
Harley-Davidson has meant quality and performance for more than 70 years. That's why AMF puts its name on the line too.
This was seen as somewhat crass by the average Harley fan, but as tantamount to blasphemy by the hardcore. This does illustrate a problem that was to become more and more serious for AMF. They were keen to promote themselves, the AMF brand, but also needed to promote the numerous other products and brands under their umbrella. Here, every Harley-Davidson petrol tank was suddenly required to wave two flags, AMF and their own. For many, this just did not gel. They reasoned with much justification that no one, ever, had aspired to ride an AMF, but many, then as now, do aspire to ride a Harley-Davidson. Similarly, the AMF push for greater and greater production began to backfire very quickly. Although there was a huge increase in production almost immediately, the Harley factories in Milwaukee were horribly out of date and thus inefficient. The pressure put on the workforce and the manufacturing engineer Tom Gelb to produce more and more with archaic tools and methods led to many leaving the motor company, taking a wealth of experience with them. As a result, everything from industrial relations to quality control suffered terribly, leading President John O'Brien to scream at Tom Gelb, "Fix this effing place." By 1974, Workforce morale was so low and the workers themselves were so angry that, according to Greg Field, poor quality in manufacturing was being supplemented with actual sabotage. Tom Gelb notes that ball bearings were dropped into cylinders, and Donnie Peterson describes how he found a 5/8 of an inch spanner jammed inside the transmission. The Harley-Davidson reputation was suffering catastrophically by 1974. And there was worse to come. On the 31st of May, the Harley-Davidson workforce went on strike for a second time in 2 years. A federal mediator negotiated a deal with the unions, but the workers rejected it in July. This is known as the 100-day strike, and it was key in persuading AMF that they needed to work smarter, not just harder at Harley-Davidson. But in 1974, motorcycle production in Milwaukee ground to a halt until AMF agreed to the workers' demands. In Milwaukee, an employee called John Bushman was found to be stealing from the factory and was convicted of major theft. This led to money and effort having to be put into better security at the motor company. And at a time when AMF was pumping many millions into Harley, especially at the massive York factory, production management and logistics were just not working because, Tom Gelb noted, the processes were so screwed up. One huge problem was that manufacturing in Milwaukee was controlled by Harley-Davidson, but manufacturing in York, Pennsylvania was controlled by AMF from New York. Things were looking surprisingly bleak for Harley-Davidson, even while they were producing motorcycles in record numbers. And in 1974, the most severe impact of the Japanese motorcycle invasion was still not apparent. If Harley and even AMF were going to survive, many things needed to change very substantially and very quickly. In the last episode, I said that the Harley-Davidson Sportster had been forced into a supporting role in its own history. 1970s history was shaping the Sportster where previously the Sportster had been making history. And there was nothing the Sportster could do about this. Worldwide recession, war and political corruption were beyond its or Harley-Davidson's influence. And the motor company itself was fighting its own internal war, horrendous quality, theft, sabotage and strikes, all of which threatened Harley-Davidson and its parent company, American Machine and Foundry. The fundamental fault with the AMF strategy can be described as impatience. On the face of it, the AMF management were wildly impatient because they were looking at the vast investment into Harley-Davidson, including the initial motor company purchase costs, and they demanded almost instant and huge returns. With many decades of hindsight, it's easy to see that AMF's mistake was that they went about things in completely the wrong order. They put the cart before the horse. Increasing production was not necessarily a bad course of action, but AMF forced Harley to produce more and more with resources that were woefully inadequate. Even by the end of 1972, production had increased by 50%, but the Milwaukee factories had already been working at a full stretch with dreadfully outdated equipment to make fewer bikes previously. If production was to be increased so much so quickly, quality was inevitably going to suffer, and so it did dreadfully. Rather than ramping up production, then modernising and expanding, John O'Brien and AMF should have opened the vast new remodelled York factory first, then invested in modernising and repurposing the Milwaukee factories second. With the new, efficient production capacity and logistics, AMF could then have increased production hugely at the same time maintaining the all-important quality control, all the while keeping a sharp and accurate eye on costs. This would have enabled Harley, and maybe AMF as well, to weather the awful storm of 1970s global recession much better. AMF impatience caused great difficulties for Harley-Davidson, but the grand old motor company did survive, and so too the Sportster XL. By the standards of the day, the 1972 Sportsters were a perfectly good machine, even if eclipsed by Japanese marques by then. Still, the Sportster with Harley-Davidson did survive, and eventually go on to achieve very great success indeed. AMF, however, did not. 1974 was certainly an Annus Horribilus for me, for Britain, America, and much of the whole world. With continuing psychological help, I survived to become happy, albeit with continuing mental health battles. World economics, though volatile, did bounce back, and even Harley-Davidson was able to fix its effing place. The Sportster XL, though, was still in a difficult transition phase which it wouldn't truly emerge from for another decade. Join me next time to see how AMF were able to establish a foundation that would enable the Harley-Davidson Motor Company to build unimaginable success and enable the Sportster XL eventually to propel itself forward all the way into the 21st century.